Blood satellite.
You remember the news about the General Lee statue that came down and was recently melted? You remember that, right?
Yes.
The Robert E. Lee statue. And it was in the news because there was all these vivid photographs and videos of it being melted down.
And WSA9 got access to these pictures showing the process of how that massive bronze statue was ultimately destroyed. An organization called Swords into Plowshares oversaw the Robert E. Lee statue's demise. Now let's back up to 2017 when the statue in Charlottesville was the center of a fierce community battle that spilled into the national spotlight over whether or not it should be removed because of Lee's ties to racism in the Confederacy.
And a lot of conservatives and people, even just nominally on the right, were upset at this, right? Just before I begin, my reaction to that was trying to remind these people who are usually conservatives and just regular Republicans, like, this was what the Charlottesville protest was about. You guys remember that, right?
Yeah.
Like that whole thing that you guys all denounced and said it was just an alt-right fucking honeypot shit show. No matter what you feel about anyone who attended that protest now, I think at the time it was a decent enough protest. There was no reason to believe it would become the war zone that it did. They did everything by the book, from what I can tell. But they were protesting the Robert E. Lee statue being torn down. They were defending it. They were meeting legally to defend it. And then I don't remember any conservatives or Republicans standing by them when that happened. Everyone threw them under the bus. Now that very statue was removed and is now being burned, everyone wants to have a fucking opinion. Well, where were you back then? That's all I'm going to say. Like, this should have been a flashpoint for the entire right, but it was only the crazy Nazis who stood up. So, like, I don't know. Like, it seems that any conservative can shut the fuck up as far as I'm concerned because they didn't do anything. What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's pretty frustrating, actually, to hear people talking about it now as if this wasn't like our Alamo.
Yeah. And again, we're Canadians. What do we know? We weren't at the protest, but I'm supportive of what occurred that day. Watching the image of Robert E. Lee's face in that oven being smelted down, that's become a bit of a meme in itself. People like that image, like the red hot face. People have it as their avatars and whatnot. And as I was watching that, I think it's important for people. I think it's important for people who want to achieve a higher form of media literacy that every time you see something in the news like this, always imagine a man with a camera standing there and taking it. Remove the fourth wall from that.
Yeah.
As this statue is being smelted down, you're fixated on that. What you should be fixated on is, why was there a guy there with a 4K camera? Like, you've never seen a statue melted before. You've never seen such high definition video and photo of this be not only taken, but also circulated. So, to me, just the image of them commissioning someone to come do it. They had to hire someone to take these photos. It wasn't incidental, right? So I'm like, oh, then this is a humiliation ritual, right?
Yeah, of course.
The only reason they're taking these images and these videos is to piss you off, to piss the people off like us, right? And I don't know, that was just that was shocking to me that they would go that far to be like, not only most statues, at least in Canada, I'll speak from the Canadian perspective, we've had a lot of statues that were taken down. Sir John A. Macdonald, Canada's first prime minister, many of his statues were taken down. And I know from individuals who are working in various municipal governments here in Ontario that a lot of them are just warehoused. A lot of the times they'll remove the statue, but they don't destroy them. They just put it somewhere. With the intent of bringing it back later or just putting it somewhere else. But they don't know what to do. They just want to get people to shut up. So this is the first time I think I've seen it not only like ripped apart, but made like it's a public spectacle ripping apart. The question was, can the image of the statue being destroyed be as relevant culturally as the statue itself? Now, some people were saying yes. Some people, they love the image of that red hot face of Robert E. Lee as it's being destroyed, almost as some kind of not a new demigod or something, but like that's a symbol. That's the symbol that we could rally around. And I guess I'll ask you that question. Like, do you think the destruction of the statue and these videos could be as unifying as the statue itself? What do you think about that?
Yes, absolutely yes. I think they made a huge mistake trying to rub that in everyone's face. Because if they had just burnt it and made it, even if they made it front page news, but it was text only, it would not have had the same impact. That is, it verges on atrocity porn, the way that they presented it. And the people today that have an association, like a mimetic association with Robert E. Lee, I think it's not even that strong. It's probably strong for people in the South, but for North American right-wingers generally, it's more the idea of we're right-wingers, we're meant to conserve our history and our culture, and you took away a thing that represented part of our history. It didn't have to be that statue. It could have been any statue. It could have been George Washington and Lincoln or whoever. They've taken a lot of them down, right? But when you take one, especially one like Lee, and you melt it like that, and you show the burning red face melting into the fire, like it's like we were saying earlier that they didn't want to release the manifesto because of the anger it would elicit. Like, you really shouldn't have done this. You really should not have sent that photographer in there, because I think this will be an image that's used to galvanize people around this issue for 20 years.
Yeah, and when I first heard that argument being made, I thought, okay, let's consider, is this a cope? And I thought about it for a while, and I don't think it is. I don't think it is for the reasons you had said. But also, this ties directly into the book I'm going to talk about, but it also reminds me of one that I'm reading currently that we're going to get to in a future episode. But the book we're going to talk about currently is Empire and Communications by Harold Innis. But the book I was just reading recently was it was Marshall McLuhan's book, Understanding Media. Have you ever read that? Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man. McLuhan's a Canadian guy. He gets circulated a lot in this scene, but I never really read anything about Marshall McLuhan, even though I should have, because if you're involved in media or advertising or anything like that, you know, a lot of stuff is built upon his theories and his work, but I think he's often misunderstood. And we'll get to that when we discuss the book. But there's this one aspect in this book particularly that struck me in talking about the statue of Robert E. Lee versus the image of the statue being burned as almost a different type of media entirely. He's got this concept of cold media versus hot media. So a cold medium and a hot medium. So a cold medium would be any sort of media that requires you to participate in it for it to be given meaning. So you would say like cold media would be a telephone, or a cold media would be like anything that requires the viewer to be a participant for it to matter. Whereas a hot media is something like exciting and electric and can like exist on its own. So like cinema would be a hot medium.
Radio is hot because it focuses singularly on the sense of hearing. It communicates its intended message entirely via sound, and radio producers work very, very hard to do that. They develop mannered delivery techniques, do careful editing and mixing, and so on and so forth. There's no room for participation between sender and receiver because radio is designed with a passive listener in mind. It's dense with information, making it high definition.
And it's not trying to say one is better than the other, but it's usually a cold media is overtaken by a hot media. And I looked at and maybe, I hope this isn't me misunderstanding the point, because it's very metaphysical, the stuff he gets into, and it's very, very engaging. And McLuhan is an amazing thinker and influential man. But to me, like the statue is almost cold media. As a medium, it's just there. It's inert. It kind of invites you in. You need to participate in it. It just doesn't really have a lot of life and vivacity to it. But the image of it being destroyed does. And the image itself, and not only the image, but the requirement that the image be passed around. Like, it has a life of its own. It's not inert. It's not cold. It's got a vibrancy to it. And it's evocative. It gets you see it, and it almost doesn't need to explain itself. Like a statue, you got to read it and you got to bring it into your context. But this, like, there's a different sort of life force to the image of it being destroyed as its own thing, and as a different form of media, as a digital image that's a meme, right? And that meme can live on as different iterations of that meme, and maybe that face changes over time, but the meme itself is the lifespan of the meme. Like, to look at a meme, it's the beginning, middle, and end of the meme. It isn't just one link in that chain, and that's what's so interesting. And so, you know, as we're gonna go into Empire Communications, I just like leading with that, which is that what I like about that, in the destruction of this old media, it becomes a new media and perhaps has more meaning, because, you know, the question is, you know, we defend these monuments and these statues and these relics, but are they really evocative? You know, are we just being trad? Are we just trying to defend these because we think they're important, but do they really inspire us? They do for some people. I'm not saying they don't inspire everyone, but, you know, you can have an interest in a museum, but does it really generate an electricity within you? For a lot of people, no. For a lot of people, it's just you want to defend it because it's being threatened by a fucking dysgenic underclass of freaks. But if it wasn't being threatened by a dysgenic underclass of freaks, you would never go to visit this statue. It might mean nothing to you. Whereas this new form means something, and can mean something perhaps even greater, because its destruction represents not just Southern identity, but this other, again, creeping dysgenic biomass that's destroying America right now. And it's this sacrifice, it becomes, you know, I don't want to get too biblical about it, but, you know, it's ascended to a different form at this point. But and in changing that media, it becomes of the people now, whereas before it was almost of the state. It was of the power structure, and now it's back in the hands of the periphery of the people. You know, it was rejected by the institutions. It was rejected by the city. These statues didn't have a home anymore in the centers of power, so they had to be adopted by the lower classes or the fringe classes, or us, what you might call the people of the periphery. And that leads me into the book I was reading, which is I really love this book. And I love the arc that we're on right now. This is called Empire and Communications by Harold Innis. And it deals with just what I was talking about there, which is it's all about how language models and media and communications have evolved throughout time, and how these media define the lives of empires. And he frames it in a sort of de Juvenalian way. Like, remember back when we talked about Juvenal, about, you know, the high-low versus the middle, about how this is where you get elite theory and things like that, about how the power can be conceptualized as concentric circles, with the center of power being, you know, the king, the emperor, the government. Then outside that, you have the intermediary institutions, the clerical class and whatnot. Then outside of that, you have the people, the citizenry, and then maybe beyond that, the slaves and whatnot. But you have those concentric circles. And so it was saying that, you know, each of these areas of power tended to generate their own media.
Throughout history, new technologies have created new opportunities for communication and culture. In fear of these opportunities, those in power have often tried to control the technologies and, as a result, restrict the spread of knowledge. Before the advent of paper and the printing press, religious authorities generally had control over knowledge. Texts were professionally hand-copied onto parchment by scribes, a laborious and expensive process. After copying, the materials were often kept in monasteries and church libraries, hidden from the public.
And whenever a type of media was captured by the center, it almost inspired the development of a different type of media on the periphery. And he cites examples from Egypt, Sumeria, Rome, Greece. He goes all throughout human history, and he finds these revolutions seem to coincide with developments of different media. And this is where you kind of get into hot and cold media, where, you know, we'll go through this in detail, but just to preface this, it's like saying that, you know, the center of power in the empire, they would love, you know, sculpture. It has a preference for communication that is optimized for time. You want to make things, you want to make engravings and sculptures and carvings that will last centuries, right? Whereas the people are concerned with communication that is tilted more towards space. You know, you don't need things to last forever, but you want to create media and documents that can go very, very far and wide and travel easily. So, you know, an example would be at the center of power, you have a lot of, you know, stone engravings. On the outside, you have papyrus. And we don't have a lot of evidence of that anymore, but it's when you have whatever is developed on the periphery will be optimized for space and quick communication and far communication. And then usually when that's adopted by the center, then that inspires something on the outside to develop. So then as you go through time, let's compare that to now, the modern era. So you have paper, which was once the people's, the vulgar thing. That was just, you know, who gives a shit? It's paper, right? That is seen as the validated, enshrined way to communicate in the center of power. That's publishing, that's library, that's academia, right? That's taken seriously, but it's dead, it's cold. What's more exciting on the periphery? That's the internet. That's all this shit. They don't understand this. And that's, if you want to see this in action right now, that is how the digital world is terrifying the traditional publishing world, and traditional publishing, once again, used to be on the outside. That used to be just something that the idea of sort of popular literature was seen as vulgar and dumb, and then eventually that becomes, you know, enshrined. But now it's memes. It's the ultimate space versus time, where the communication we do breaks apart in seconds. You know, trends break down within hours sometimes. And so we're just in like a hyper realized version of what he's talking about in this book right now. And I just wanted to say that to show that whatever we talk about now is still relevant in the modern age. So I'll start by just kind of reading from the book, because I have a lot of notes here that I'm going to read them because I like them. And you tell me what you think about this. So he says, monopolies of knowledge had developed and declined partly in relation to the medium of communication on which they were built, and tended to alternate as they emphasized religion, decentralization, and time and force. The tendency of each medium of communication is to create monopolies of knowledge to the point where the human spirit breaks through at new levels of society and on the outer fringes. So in the traditional society, this would be like the clerical class. So in various empires throughout history, you would have whatever the clerical class might be. It might be priests, it might be shaman, it might be whatever it is, but they would become like the holders of the knowledge, and they would monopolize not only the interpretation of the knowledge, but also the processing of it. And you would still see this in Judaism too. He talks a bit about Judaism in the book, that what made Judaism so unique was how it emphasized its clerical class above all others. Because, you know, within Christianity, you have a priest class and you have pastors, but you have to understand that within Christianity, they're nothing like the way rabbis are treated. Like, rabbis are treated as this higher order form of Jew, like the keepers of the knowledge. And you still see that echoed within Jewish culture to this day. But he was saying that, you know, at one time, that sort of that mode of keeping knowledge made it longer lasting than just like different types of records. Now he says here, concentration on a medium of communication implies a bias in the cultural development of the civilization concerned either towards an emphasis on space and political organization, or towards an emphasis on time and religious organization. Introduction of a second medium tends to check the bias of the first and to create conditions suited for the growth of the empire. And there's a lot of empires throughout history that, when people think empire, they tend to think Rome, and that every empire is like Rome, and America's compared to Rome a lot. And that's not really how it is. There were mercantile empires throughout history that, weren't even concerned with creating their own monuments. They were just wanted to be massive trade networks. And some of the, Sumerian cuneiform script showed that they emphasized, space over time, and their writing was just to be made as quick as possible and to transmit as far as possible. So, the idea of just having an empire that was empires didn't always try and be permanent, is what he's saying, and there's always negotiation between these what it was actually trying to be. And he says here, the concepts of time and space have significance in how empires and civilizations prioritize their media, whether it be long-lasting like sculpture or easy to spread like paper. The concept of empire is measured on the efficiency of communication. Prior to the written word, oral traditions harnessed more rhythm and poetry to make things memorable, right? And many linguists see the written word as a corruption of that thought. I never considered that before. That was just sort of an investigation you had in the book. The benefit of the written word was that the written word allowed people to interface with an abstract world of symbols and concepts and improve their time horizons. But I like the idea that, you have that. There's this idea that, I actually heard in a song, the cognitive trade-off hypothesis, saying that, when we were monkeys, our brains had to adapt more towards, in the moment calculations of our surroundings, so we could actually calculate more information faster, but we had zero time horizon. So by introducing more abstract modes of thought, we made it so we can conceptualize time and space and things like that, and hypotheticals, but it meant that we kind of got worse at processing immediate data. So I just like the idea that, there's an argument in the book that, the written word killed human thought. I never heard it phrased like that before. And just to give an example of what he was talking about here, he plays around with, similar to like McLuhan talking about hot and cold media. He says, in ancient Egypt, writing on stone was characterized by straightness or circularity of the line, the rectangularity of form and an upright position, whereas writing on papyrus permitted cursive forms suited to rapid writing. And by escaping the heavy medium of stone, thought gained lightness. A marked increase in writing by hand was accompanied by secularization of writing, thought, and activity. So, we're not going to get into the whole medium is the message thing by McLuhan. That's a whole other episode in itself, but it's saying like by making it easier to write, you changed how people thought and communicated, so you could express weirder ideas. So like as you permitted and introduced different types of documentation and record keeping, you permitted new ideas to emerge, and these ideas couldn't have emerged if you were just communicating with sculpture. So with each new medium comes the introduction of new ideas. So it means that like, as new forms of communication are emerging on the fringes, it almost by its own nature encourages radical new thought. I think that was just an interesting way of doing, like, why is it that the fringes are always coming up? Why is it that always new media forms have weird new shit going on in them? Well, that's because like that's its nature to be, He talks a lot about Egypt early on in the book, and he says the spread of writing after the democratic revolution in Egypt was accompanied by the emergence of new religions and the immortality cult of Horus and Osiris. So in Egypt, as these new forms of writing were emerging, they were coming up with new religions. Ra worship had become too political. And individuals found a final meaning in a fulfillment in life beyond the vicissitudes of the political arbiter. So it's like a new revolutionary religions were emerging as you saw papyrus start to propagate. Since to know the name of a being was to have the means of mastering him, to pronounce the name was to fashion the spiritual image by the voice, and to write it, especially with hieroglyphics, was to draw a material image. And this is where we get into I'm going to pronounce his name wrong, and this is a big one because I know there's guys who listen who know this book very, very well. The example I'm going to give, but it's Akhenaten, 1380 to 1362 BC, possibly with the support of the English priests who held higher beliefs as philosophers. They came up with this crazy new idea. The new idea was the one and only God. So they decided to create one of the first state religions as a result, because there's too much of this weird new stuff happening on the peripheries. Let's make a new state religion. And he attempted to introduce a system of worship which would provide a religious basis for imperial development. The worship of Aten, or the solar disk, was a device for creating a united Orient. So this is like one of the first examples of religious statecraft. And there is a claim in the book, and I think this has been backed up elsewhere, that one of the very, very first examples of a monotheistic mythological song was called the Song of the Disc. So, just imagine a bunch of bureaucrats trying to come up with a new song everyone has to sing. And it didn't take off. Like, it didn't work, really. So people still were going at Ra and Osiris. It said the spread of a more efficient system of writing, which followed the discovery of the alphabet, had profound implications for imperial organization. Priestly colleges held a monopoly of knowledge through which they dominated successive organizations of political power. But the very process of monopolies contributed to the destruction of empires. Dominance of monopolies of knowledge in the center of civilizations implied limitations on the fringes, particularly with new languages compelled to emphasize simplicity rather than complexity in writing. Marginal classes, as well as marginal regions, demanded simplicity and weakened the position of the elaborate systems of the scribes. And so this is the eternal conflict. And that's a conflict we see even now, where, like, in modern era, the document-based, typographical bureaucracy of the state apparatus is constantly threatened by the new forms of whatever's happening on the digital fringes. And sometimes you even see, the technocrats engaging in this. Like, why can't we wipe all this fucking litigious nonsense away and actually find new ways and more effective ways to communicate? And we still really haven't resolved that. And what's interesting is, now we are starting to see that. We're starting to see the center of power trying to adopt more, interesting digital fringe ways of communication, which is going to demand that we come up with something new. You know what I mean? As same thing with Bitcoin. Like, as the centers, the locuses of power get a stranglehold over cryptocurrency, that's going to have to force us to come up with something analogous to that on the outside. But like, we just the idea that a monopoly in the center of power necessarily encourages innovations on the periphery, no matter where the empire is. Like, it doesn't need to be by barbarians or serfs or any sort of like dysgenic horde, because some people hear the fringe and think, oh, that the outcasts of society. It's like, well, no, it's just those far from the center of power. And you could see that in completely ethnically homogenous societies if you wanted to. It doesn't need to be Rome where nearly everyone's a slave. Yeah, here's just a part about the Jews that I found interesting. It says, since sculpture occupied a prominent place in the support of religious and political institutions, it was prohibited in images by the Hebrews. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above. We all know that. The written letter replaced the graven image as the object of worship. Interesting transition. In Israel and Judah, the prophets of the 7th and 6th centuries reduced a multitude of gods to one and transformed Judaism by giving religion an ethical basis. With few abstract terms and without powers of rationalization, the Judaism of antiquity produced no philosophers. Religion was made ethical by a personal, direct, vivid vision. Religion became the sole cause of all history and historical narratives, a device for religious education. Political and economic forces were then subordinated to it. The priest's code, with the heavy economic burdens of a cultic system, left no place for a king. This is how Judaism became its own self-contained thing. So like right around, like that was the idea of Judaism being like historically distinct as like this new creature is kind of, no matter what you might think of that, that is why it's kind of still around in that sense. And the amount of power and influence it gives the rabbinical class. He's got this really interesting part here. So a lot of people are aware of the term dialectic or a dialectical approach. A lot of people hear dialectic and they think Marxism. They think the materialist dialectic and things like that. The dialectic being, two opposing ideas and there's a synthesis created in them. Now, he actually traces that back even further. He traces that back to the Socratic dialogue. And the Socratic dialogue is, in essence, a dialectic. It's two opposing views that kind of reach a synthesis at the end. And he's got this part here. I'll just read it. And I found this. I don't know where exactly to place this. I just found it very interesting. He says, the task of understanding a culture built on the oral tradition is impossible for students steeped in the written tradition. And this is something we talk about a lot. Like, the idea of us, modern Westerners, to really comprehend how the mind of someone who only has like an oral tradition works. Like, even though Aboriginals say they do, they don't really. Like, you'd have to go find an uncontacted tribe and see how their minds, without sort of the permanence of the written language or the ability when literacy gives you the ability to think abstractly about the worlds of symbols and forms, they lack that completely. So how do they conceptualize time? They'll conceptualize time and space completely different than you, right? So he says, it's difficult for people like us to understand that. Recognition of its significance has been evident in the concern of scholars over centuries with interpretations of records, but the similarity of the Greek alphabet to the modern alphabet and the integral relation of Greek civilization to Western civilization implies dependence on the complex art of introspection. With Socrates, the power of the oral tradition persisted in his prose in the absence of a closely ordered system. The life and movement of dialectic opposed the establishment of a finished system of dogma. He's basically saying that, what remained with us from the Greek tradition is, and that this is distinct to the Western mind, I believe, or the European mind, is a dialectical approach to things. Far from being just this Marxist way of approaching the world. Like, I think he's making the case that the dialectical approach can trace its roots back to Greek antiquity, and that is that's in our DNA right now, and perhaps in all Europeans, and that will be completely absent in the Eastern mind. That's the case he's making. I think there's a lot of truth to that. And he says here, the spread of writing contributed to the collapse of Greek civilization by widening the gap between the city-states. The powerful oral tradition of the Greeks drove a wedge between the political empire concept, with its emphasis on space, and the ecclesiastical empire concept with its emphasis on time, and reduced them to the rational proportions of the city-state. But the destruction of the concepts of absolutism assumed a new approach of rationalism, which was to change the concept of history in the West. The achievements of a rich oral tradition in Greek civilization became the basis of Western culture. So he's saying that oral dialectical, like the Socratic dialogue, is the essence of Western tradition as we know it. Which is an interesting way of looking at it. And I don't know if that, you want to say that's the acorn of which the great tree grew from. But I do think like this idea, like our minds can't conceive of a relationship with reality that is not almost dialectical. Anyway, I'm not sure people agree with that, but I think there's for people who are allergic to that idea because they think it's just communist bullshit. It goes back deeper than that. And he gives a few more examples here of the exact interchange that we're talking about here. He says, parchment as adapted to the demands of monasticism had contributed to the development of a powerful ecclesiastical organization in Western Europe. The monopoly of knowledge which had been built up invited competition from a new medium of communication which appeared on the fringes of Western European culture, and was available to meet the demands of the lower strata of society. The impact of Mohammedanism, which followed its abhorrence of images, was enormously strengthened by a new medium, of which the written word became a potent force. The wide gap between the governing and the lower classes in China facilitated the spread of Buddhism from India. The monopoly of knowledge of the Veda by the Brahmins invited the introduction of a medium from the periphery which could appeal to the lower classes. In China, Buddhism found an efficient medium of communication in paper and emphasis on the importance of a knowledge in writing. So all around the world, you see these sort of mind revolutions occurring as the paper becomes more readily available. And it's usually used as a way to attack the center of power. And even in the modern era, he says the rise of vernacular literature was hastened by the growth of nationalism. He says the papacy triumphed over the council as representative of the church through the support of canon lawyers in 1448, but its success led to the Reformation. And there's a quote here from a guy named Rashdal. He says, the worst corruption of the Middle Ages lay in the transformation of the sacerdotal hierarchy into a hierarchy of lawyers. And that's an interesting thing too. Like you see all throughout, in various points in history in these empires, you see like these revolutions by the intelligentsia. And even in America, you see almost like a revolution of lawyers. Like, how is it that lawyers have become to achieve such a high status in American society? That's fucking weird, isn't it? Like, it just happens that lawyers are sort of the intelligentsia of the piece of paper. You know what I mean? Like, they're the new clerical class. They're the one. Lawyers have a monopoly on the law, and the law is how this entire secular humanist nation runs. So if you have, that's why it seems so common for presidents and politicians to be lawyers themselves. It's almost assumed, like, to even rise to power in the society, you have to have a command of the law or be a lawyer in some way. And I'm like, that's a weird thing, isn't it? But like in America, it would seem that the clerical class, as we know it, would be lawyers. I don't know if a lot of people would disagree with that even. Yeah, he's just got a whole block here that kind of summarizes a bunch of them. He says, the growth of bureaucracy in the Roman Empire had followed dependence on the papyrus roll, but stability assumed a fusion with religious organization based on the parchment codex. Bureaucracy in terms of the state implied an emphasis on space and a neglect of the problems of time. The tenacity of the Byzantine Empire assumed achievement of a balance which recognized the role of space and time. The dominance of parchment in the West involved an exaggeration on the significance of time. A monopoly of knowledge based on parchment invited competition from a new medium such as paper, which emphasized the significance of space as reflected in the growth of the nationalist monarchies. So it's like every time, there's always a reaction, no matter what the medium is. So again, we go back to the McLuhan thing of like a hot medium becomes cold. And when that happens, a new hot medium emerges, and it's just always just switching sides. And it seems like it seems obvious to me that that's just going to happen forever. Like, that's just a naturally occurring phenomenon. And that's why, like, when we talk about this, I like to think ahead for, okay, what happens when digital communication becomes cooled, when it becomes the statue that needs to be destroyed to reinvigorate life into it, you know? It just got one part here at the end that I like, and I think it kind of summarizes in a more modern sense what he's talking about. He says, in common law countries, particularly adapted to trade and emphasizing freedom of the press, monopoly of communication accentuates monopolistic tendencies in the publication of newspapers, periodicals, and books. these changes have profound implications for empire. And I think that's really where it stands now, which is empires seem to rise and fall based on how well they can integrate the changes on the periphery and what they can sort of learn from that. And so I think that's why in America, especially in North America, I think the center of power is doing a pretty good job of trying to, in a sense, ruin what's going on in the periphery. And I think it's high time that as that's occurring, we start to think about, what new media forms we can come up with. And remember that, like, the purpose of a media form, and I talked about this in an unreleased Real Secret Coffee Hours episode, but one thing that was kind of just sticking in the back of my head was that for us to realize where we are in relationship to power, like, we are on the outside, we are in the innovative space, and there's a lot of us who I believe are thinking in terms of time when we should be thinking in terms of space. A lot of artists too, they want to make things that last forever, and we might not really have that ability. The things that last forever tend to be created, with its proximity to power. Our job really is to find whatever media is at our disposal that maximizes space. What can move furthest? What can be transmitted fastest? What can be understood the easiest? That's what a meme is. A meme is like the particle, like the fundamental particle of what we're talking about. It is the essence of space over time. And I think that's what the centers of power and the cool media is never going to understand. It's going to try and capture that. Every time it tries to wrap its hands around what a meme is, it slips through its fingers, because they're trying to make memes permanent. They're trying to make memes official, make it, serious, but it can't be serious. Like, this is just the innovation of papyrus. And I think that we do ourselves a disservice if we look at what we're doing and try not and think of it anything other than, we need to make things simpler and faster and more effective, rather than just emulating what we think is more serious. Does that make any sense? Yeah. All right. So I know we got to get going now, but that was just Empire and Communications by Harold Innis. Once again, it's a discussion about how forms and media of communication are always, and it's tracking like the linguistic tension and the battle between competing languages within an empire itself is fascinating, because that is the relationship. Like, when you think of like the center of power, the Juvenalian concentric circles going out, you're like, well, how do these interface with each other? Like, how do revolutions occur? How do these things happen? How is it that something could be occurring on the fringes of society that the center of power doesn't even know about? Well, that's because they're using a completely different language. You know what I mean? You know what I was, just as a really morbid example, I was watching a documentary about how they caught this infamous pedophile, a sex tourist, the Mr. Swirl thing.
Oh,
so
the
those
Mr.
who don't
Swirl
know,
thing?
this was a guy who was a sex. He would go to Malaysia. He would go to the Philippines. Where did these guys go? He was a white guy from Vancouver. And he was not only caught with child pornography, he was making child pornography himself, and he was appearing in the photos. And apparently, I didn't know this, but I guess it would make sense. Within that community, you're given more street cred if you're in the photos, because it's riskier, right? And so they had him in the photos, but they didn't know who he was. Why? Because his face was a swirl, right? It's like, who is this genius who swirled his face? And they were trying for weeks, months. They had Interpol involved. They had actually, what's funny is you never hear that the local authorities are involved in this. The Malaysians act like this is a grievous offense against their culture. You didn't care about this until like Interpol came looking for him. So how about you shut the fuck up? You're just kind of embarrassed now. But anyway, the point is that they were like, how is this hacker genius doing this? And it took them weeks and chasing him around the globe. And then someone figured out, this looks like a Photoshop filter. So they could take the photos, put it in Photoshop, and reverse the swirl, because that's all he fucking did, right? But that's just evidence like that they didn't know this language. They didn't know this Photoshop thing. They didn't know that this group on the fringes were just using Photoshop to fuck with photos. They just assumed it was like this big complicated thing. But you have the digital natives using a language that these old-headed people just don't get. And that's a really bad example, of course, but it's an example. It's an example of like how they're always playing catch up with what's happening on the outside. They're always, and like I said, in the past, I've had some dealings with nonprofits and even some nonprofits who are engaged in anti-extremism measures. And if you've seen the internal communications from these people, they don't know what's going on out here. Like their conceptualization of the far right is like the KKK. They think the KKK is still like a big thing. Yeah. And they think the Christian nationalism movement is like the scariest thing in the world. You know what I mean? Like they don't know. Yeah. They don't know the spaces because they're old government bureaucrats who still don't kind of understand what the internet is. They don't speak the fucking language. It takes them years to speak the language. It takes them years to understand the tools. Eventually they do, but then you're outpacing them. So anyway, that's just a more practical relationship or a practical example of what I think is actually going on. Anyway.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.